The stagecoach lurched into Redemption Gulch like a tired beast finally brought to its knees. Dust, the color of rust and regret, billowed in its wake, coating Ilara's dark traveling dress with another layer of the unforgiving territory. She clutched the worn leather of her Bible, its familiar weight, a small, solid anchor in a sea of apprehension. In her other hand, hidden within a reticule, was the letter, a piece of paper that held the entire architecture of her future, signed by a man named Jedediah Croft. The words of his advertisement were etched into her memory, promising a respectable partnership, a new life for a practical, God-fearing woman in a land of opportunity. Ilara, an orphan raised on scripture and scrubbing brushes, had believed she was exactly that. Hope, however, felt fragile here. It was a wildflower trying to grow from rock. The town was a gash in the landscape, a collection of sun-bleached wooden buildings huddled together as if for protection against the vast, indifferent sky. Men with eyes as hard and flat as river stones watched the stagecoach empty, their gazes lingering on Ilara with a mixture of curiosity and appraisal that made her skin prickle. She pulled her shawl tighter, her gaze fixed on the largest building, a sign proclaiming Croft's Mercantile, provisions swinging mournfully on a single hinge. This was it, the beginning. Jedediah Croft was a man whose piety was a garment he wore for public display. He stood behind his counter, a thick man with a prosperous belly and a thin mouth, polishing a jar of pickled eggs as if it were a holy relic. When Ilara entered, a small bell tinkling above the door, his eyes swept over her. He took in the simple, mended dress, the plain cross hanging from a cord around her neck, and the Bible held firmly in her grasp. A flicker of something disappointment, then disdain tightened his face. "You'll be the woman from the advertisement," he stated. It was not a question. "I am," Ilara said, her voice softer than she intended. She took a step forward, offering the letter like a passport. "Ilara, I have come, as we agreed in our correspondence." Croft ignored the letter. He leaned on the counter, his bulk seeming to suck the air from the small space. The advertisement called for a practical woman, a woman who understands that survival in this place is a matter of calloused hands and a strong back, not this. He gestured with a dismissive flick of his fingers towards her Bible. "I ask for a partner, not a parishioner. I have a business to run, a homestead to build. I have no time for psalm singing and prayer meetings." The cruelty of his words was a physical blow. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. "Sir, my faith does not hinder my ability to work. It is the very source of my strength. I can cook, I can clean, I can keep accounts. I need a wife, woman, not a church mouse." His voice rose, sharp and ugly, drawing the attention of two other customers who began to watch with undisguised interest. "I see you now, and I see my mistake. You have the look of someone who would pray over a sick chicken instead of wringing its neck for supper. This land has no place for that kind of softness." He straightened up, his decision made, his face a mask of self-righteous finality. "I rescind my offer. The arrangement is cancelled." It couldn't be real. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "But your letter. You paid for my passage. Where am I to go?" The plea was a whisper of pure terror. "That is a matter between you and your God," Croft said, turning his back on her to rearrange a stack of tinned peaches. The dismissal was absolute. He had cast her out as easily as sweeping dust from his porch. Humiliation burned hotter than the sun outside. She stood frozen for a moment, the stares of the other men like needles in her skin. Then, with what little dignity she could muster, she turned and walked out, leaving her single, scuffed suitcase on the boardwalk where the stage driver had left it. She was marooned, an island of one in an ocean of dust and hostility. The door to Croft's Mercantile was a closed mouth, and the town looked on, a silent, judging jury. From across the street, leaning against the shadowed wall of the livery, a man had watched the whole miserable spectacle unfold. He was a man the town knew but did not speak to, a man who lived on the edge of things both geographically and socially. His name was Silas, and his past was a story told in whispers and warnings. He saw the proud, straight set of the woman's shoulders as she was turned away, and he saw the almost imperceptible tremble in her hands as she stood alone on the boardwalk. He recognized the look in her eyes, not just fear, but the banked fire of someone who had been cornered but was not yet broken. He had worn that same look himself for more years than he cared to remember. The day bled away. Ilara tried the town's only boarding house, but the proprietor, a woman with a face like sour milk, took one look at her, and having heard the gossip already, declared she had no rooms. She approached the small, steepled church, but its doors were locked, a note indicating the preacher was riding circuit and would not be back for a week. She was a stain the town was determined to ignore until she vanished. As the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, a cold wind started to whip through the street, carrying the scent of sagebrush and coming winter. She had nowhere to go. Her hope had finally guttered out, leaving only the cold ash of despair. It was then that he approached, a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette against the dying light. Silas moved without a sound, his steps measured and deliberate. Ilara flinched as his shadow fell over her, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was scarred, a faint white line bisecting one eyebrow and disappearing into his hairline. His eyes, in the twilight, were impossible to read. "You can't stay here," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together, unused to conversation. Ilara swallowed, her throat dry and tight. "I have nowhere else." He gave a short, sharp nod, as if confirming a fact he already knew. He looked at her suitcase, then back at her face. The silence stretched, filled only by the keening of the wind. She thought he might just turn and leave her there, another of the town's silent observers. But he didn't. "I have a place," he said, the words offered without preamble or adornment. "It's warm. It's safe." Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. Everything she had been taught warned her against a man like this, an outcast, a man of shadows. But the memory of Croft's sneering face, of the boarding house door closing, of the absolute, crushing loneliness of this place, was a more immediate terror. This man, for all his forbidding appearance, had not looked at her with contempt. He had simply looked. She saw in his gaze not pity, but a kind of stark recognition. It was the look of a fellow survivor, taking a shuddering breath, a prayer forming silently on her lips. She made the only choice left to her. "All right," she breathed. Silas simply nodded again, picked up her suitcase as if it weighed nothing, and started walking. Ilara hesitated for only a second before following him, away from the faint lights of Redemption Gulch and into the encroaching darkness. His cabin was nestled in a small canyon a mile out of town, sheltered from the wind by a stand of gnarled junipers. It was a small, solid structure of hewn logs, chinked neatly with clay. A thin curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney, a beacon of warmth in the vast, cold landscape. Inside, the space was Spartan but immaculate. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a simple cot was pushed against another, and a rough-hewn table with 2 stools stood in the center. Everything had its place. There was no clutter, no waste. It was the home of a man who lived a deliberate, pared-down existence. He gestured to the cot. "That's yours." He took a blanket from a chest at the foot of his own bedroll on the floor and placed it there. He said nothing more, moving to the fireplace to stir the embers, adding another log. The silence was not awkward, but dense, filled with the unspoken questions hanging between them. Ilara, exhausted to her very bones, sat on the edge of the cot, her hands clasped in her lap. She was in the home of a stranger, a reputed outlaw, yet for the first time since arriving in this God-forsaken land, a measure of the frantic terror in her chest began to subside. Here, at least, she was not being judged. The first few days passed in a quiet rhythm of observation. Ilara, accustomed to a life of service and work, found herself adrift, but slowly she began to find her place. She would rise early, while he was outside tending to his horse and the small traps he set for rabbits. She would take their meager provisions: flour, dried beans, coffee, and make a simple meal. She found a broom and swept the packed earth floor. She found his mending kit and, without asking, stitched a tear in the sleeve of his work shirt while he was gone. They rarely spoke more than a few words at a time. "Coffee's hot." "I'll fetch water." "Thank you." Each word was a carefully placed stone in the foundation of a fragile trust. He never approached her, never made her feel threatened. He afforded her a privacy that was almost reverent. He would leave for hours at a time, and she learned to read the signs of his return by the way his horse, a stoic grey gelding, would prick its ears. One afternoon, she returned from a walk to find a single, perfect blue jay feather placed in the center of the table. It was a silent offering, a small piece of beauty in their stark world. That night, she used some of her own dwindling thread to embroider a simple flower on the corner of one of his threadbare hand towels. These were the conversations they had, spoken in a language of quiet gestures. A week after her arrival, a storm rolled in, a furious, black-bellied squall that threw rain against the cabin like handfuls of gravel. The wind howled through the canyon, and the world outside was reduced to a grey, roaring chaos. Trapped inside, the small space seemed to shrink around them. Silas sat by the fire, sharpening a knife with methodical strokes, while Ilara sat at the table, her Bible open but her eyes unseeing. "He was wrong, you know," Silas said, his voice so sudden it made her jump. He hadn't stopped his work, his eyes still on the blade. "Croft." Ilara looked at him, surprised. "What he said about your faith. That it's a weakness." He finally looked up, his gaze direct. "It takes a hard kind of strength to hold on to something like that in a place like this. I've seen men with nothing to hold on to. They break, or they turn into men like him." The unexpected defense of her deepest conviction unlocked something in her. The words began to pour out, a quiet torrent of her story, her childhood, with a grandmother whose hands were gnarled from work, but whose spirit was unbent, who taught her that faith was not a shield from hardship, but the strength to endure it. She spoke of the hope that had carried her across the country, and the crushing weight of its demise. When she finished, her voice thick with emotion, the cabin was silent, save for the crackling fire and the drumming rain. Silas had put down his knife. He stared into the flames for a long time before he spoke. "I had a family once," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "A wife, a son. They were taken by the river fever, back in Missouri. Everything I was, everything I had, it was all washed away with them." He paused, the pain, a living thing in the small room. "A man who has lost everything can become a very dangerous animal. I did things I ain't proud of. That's how I got this." He touched the scar on his brow. "That life is over, but the reputation sticks to you. Like mud you can't ever wash off." He did not ask for pity or absolution. He was merely trading one truth for another. In that moment, they were no longer an outlaw and a cast-off. They were simply two people, marked by loss, who had found a fleeting moment of sanctuary together in the heart of a storm. A bond had been forged, not of passion, but of the profound and solemn understanding of shared pain. The storm passed, leaving the air clean and sharp. A new routine settled over them, more comfortable than before. In the evenings, after their meal, Ilara would often read aloud from her Bible. She chose the Psalms, their ancient poetry of sorrow, hope, and resilience seeming to fit the landscape. Silas would sit by the fire, mending tack or carving small figures from scraps of wood, and he would listen. At first, she thought he was merely tolerating it, but she began to notice the way his hands would still, the way his gaze would fix on the fire, lost in thought. He never commented, but his silence was no longer empty. It was attentive. This fragile peace, however, was not destined to last. Redemption Gulch was a town that fed on gossip, and the story of the rejected mail-order bride shacking up with the outlaw on the ridge was too delicious to ignore. The tale reached Jedediah Croft, and it festered in his petty, prideful heart. It was an insult. That the woman he had deemed too piously soft was now living under the roof of a man he considered filth was a direct challenge to his standing in the town he lorded over. One afternoon, the sound of hoofbeats echoed in the canyon. Ilara's heart leaped into her throat. It was Croft, and he had brought 2 of his cronies with him. They reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin, their faces smug and righteous. "Silas," Croft bellowed, not dismounting. "We've come for the woman. It ain't right, her being out here with a man of your character. It's a moral disgrace. We're taking her back to town, where she can be cared for properly." Silas emerged from the cabin, wiping his hands on a rag. He moved without haste, planting his feet before the porch. He looked less like a man and more like a part of the landscape, as solid and unmovable as the canyon walls. Ilara watched from the doorway, her hands twisting in her apron. "She ain't going anywhere," Silas said, his voice flat and cold. "That's not for you to decide," one of Croft's men sneered. "She's a helpless female, fallen into your clutches." Before Silas could respond, Ilara stepped out onto the porch to stand beside him. The movement was small, but it was a declaration. "I am not helpless," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "And I have not fallen. I was pushed. By him." She pointed a shaking finger at Croft. Croft's face mottled with rage at her defiance. "You see, he's twisted her mind. We're taking her." He made to dismount. Silas took a single step forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the pistol he sometimes wore at his hip. He simply met Croft's gaze with an intensity that promised a violence Croft had only ever read about. "This is her home now," Silas said, the words dropping like stones into the sudden silence. "She is under my protection. Get off my land. Now." It was the ghost of the old Silas that looked out from his eyes in that moment, a flicker of the dangerous man he had once been. Croft and his men saw it. They exchanged uneasy glances, their bluster deflating under that unwavering stare. Muttering threats, they wheeled their horses around and rode away, their righteous crusade collapsing into a graceless retreat. The immediate danger had passed, but they both knew it was only a reprieve. Croft was a man who could not abide being defied. He would use other weapons. A few weeks later, his new strategy arrived in the form of a fever that swept through the region. It came on fast, a burning heat that stole a man's strength and clouded his mind. And it came for Silas. Ilara found him one morning slumped by the woodpile, his skin burning to the touch, his body racked with shivers despite the autumn sun. She half carried, half dragged him inside and onto his bedroll. For the next 4 days, the world shrank to the size of that small, dim cabin. All her grandmother's lessons, all the herbal remedies and practical nursing skills came flooding back. She brewed yarrow tea to break the fever, she bathed his face with cool water, she forced broth between his cracked lips. She was no longer the frightened waif. She was a warrior. She fought the sickness with a fierce, quiet tenacity. In his delirium, he would cry out, mumbling names she didn't know, a woman, a child. She would soothe him, her hand on his forehead, her voice a low murmur of prayer and reassurance. In those long, terrifying hours, she felt the last of her fear of him burn away, replaced by a desperate, aching fear for him. She was not just tending to a benefactor. She was fighting for the only person in the world who had shown her true charity. On the 5th day, the fever broke. Silas awoke, weak and drenched in sweat, but his eyes were clear. He watched her for a long time as she moved about the cabin, her face pale with exhaustion. He saw the strength he had glimpsed in her on that first day, now honed to a fine, sharp edge. He saw her faith not as words in a book, but as the relentless, powerful action that had saved his life. It was a faith of resilience, a faith of works, a faith that had redeemed him from the brink of death. Their bond, already rooted in shared hardship, now blossomed in the aftermath of the crisis. The quiet between them was no longer just comfortable, it was intimate. A shared look across the table held more meaning than 1,000 words. He was healing, his strength slowly returning, but the ordeal had changed them both. It had tested their unspoken commitment and found it absolute. But Jedediah Croft's malice had not abated. Humiliated in his confrontation, and hearing that the outlaw was now sick and weakened, he saw his chance. He rode to the next county and found the circuit marshal, a hard man named Cobb, filling his ears with a poisoned tale of a dangerous criminal who had abducted an innocent woman and was holding her against her will. He painted himself as the concerned citizen, the moral guardian of the community. Marshal Cobb arrived at the cabin with Croft and 2 deputies in tow. Silas was on his feet but still gaunt, standing on the porch as they rode up. Ilara was right behind him. "Silas," the marshal said, his hand resting on his gun. "I have a complaint from Mr. Croft here. He says you're holding this woman, Miss Ilara, against her will." "He's a liar," Silas said simply. "Let the woman speak for herself," Cobb ordered. He turned his gaze on Ilara. "Ma'am, are you here of your own free will? You can tell me the truth. We'll see you protected." This was the moment. The culmination of all the cruelty, all the fear, and all the unexpected kindness. Ilara stepped forward, her back straight, her eyes blazing with a righteous fire that would have shocked the woman who had first stepped off that stagecoach. She did not look at the marshal. She looked directly at Jedediah Croft. "Against my will," she began, her voice ringing with newfound power. "Let me tell you about will, Mr. Croft. When you cast me out with nothing but the clothes on my back, you willed that I should perish. When you sneered at my faith, you willed that my spirit should break. You speak of piety, but you showed me no Christian charity. You, who call yourself a pillar of the community, left me to the mercy of the dust and the wind." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the deputies and the marshal, who were listening with rapt attention. Then she turned her eyes, softened with a fierce loyalty, to the man standing beside her. "This man," she declared, her voice resonating in the quiet canyon, "this outlaw you so despise, he did what you would not. He saw a human being in need and offered shelter. He asked for nothing in return. He gave me a home when the world offered me none. He showed me respect when all I had received was scorn. I have seen more of God's grace in this simple cabin than in every hollow prayer you have ever uttered in public, Mr. Croft. I am here of my own free will. This is my home, and this is my family." The final words hung in the air. An unassailable truth. A woman from the town, the blacksmith's wife whose son, Ilara, had given a poultice to just days before, had followed the posse out of concern. She now spoke up from a short distance away. "Marshal, she's telling the truth. That woman has been a blessing. Croft's just got a burr in his saddle because she wouldn't have him." Marshal Cobb looked from Ilara's resolute face to Silas's quiet strength, and then to Croft's sputtering, red-faced fury. He was a man who had seen his share of liars and hypocrites. He had seen true character, and it wasn't standing with Jedediah Croft. "Mr. Croft," the marshal said, his voice laced with finality. "It seems this is a personal matter you've tried to make official business. I suggest you go home, and I suggest you leave these people be." He turned his horse, his deputies following suit. The threat was neutralized, not by a gun, but by the undeniable power of the truth. Croft was left standing there, exposed and diminished, his authority shattered. In the aftermath, a profound peace settled over the small cabin in the canyon. The town of Redemption Gulch, having witnessed Croft's public humiliation, began to afford the couple on the ridge a new kind of grudging respect. They were no longer whispers and warnings. They were a quiet, solid fact of the landscape. They had faced down the worst of the town's judgment and had won. The cabin began to transform. Silas, with his strength fully returned, started building a new room onto the side. It was slow, careful work. He was not just adding walls, he was building a future. Ilara planted a small garden, coaxing stubborn life from the dry soil. Their home was no longer just a shelter. It was a testament to their shared resilience. One evening, Silas presented her with a small, intricately carved bird, its wings outstretched as if in flight. She looked at him, her heart full, and knew that the love between them needed no grand declarations. It existed in the solid walls of their home, in the shared meals, in the quiet companionship of the evenings. One cool, clear night, they sat on the newly built porch, watching as the last light of the sun set the canyon ablaze with color. Ilara was reading, not from her Bible, but from a small book of poems Silas had traded for in town. He sat beside her, sanding a piece of wood, the rhythmic sound a peaceful counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets. She finished a verse and looked up, her gaze falling on the vast, star-dusted sky. The harshness of this land had not changed, but it no longer felt threatening. It felt like home. She had arrived seeking a life promised by a stranger, only to have it torn away. And in its place, in the most unlikely of sanctuaries, and with the most unexpected of saviors, she had built something far more real, far more true. She had found her redemption, and in doing so, had offered it to another. Here, in the quiet heart of the wilderness, two broken souls had found a way to be whole.